5 Australian soldiers are lying face down in the Vietnamese jungle. They haven't spoken in 3 days. They haven't eaten a hot meal. They haven't moved more than a few hundred meters since sunrise. And right now, 30 meters away, an enemy patrol is walking directly toward them. The Australians don't radio for backup. They don't prepare to engage. They do something that goes against every instinct a soldier is trained to have. They wait. They breathe. They disappear into the jungle floor. The enemy passes. Close enough to hear, close enough to touch. And the Australians let them go. Not because they are afraid, not because they lack the firepower, but because this is not the moment they have chosen. And in the Australian SAS, you only fight when you decide to fight. This is the story of how a small group of soldiers from the other side of the world walked into one of history's most controversial wars and quietly refused to fight it the way everyone else was fighting it. While American generals were measuring success in body counts and bombing runs, 5 men in the dark were counting footprints in the mud, mapping supply routes from memory, and learning the enemy's patterns with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. What they'd built in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1972 was not the loudest chapter of the Vietnam War. It was not the most photographed or the most reported. But decades later, military analysts on both sides of the Pacific would look back and call it the most effective. By 1966, the war in Vietnam had split into 2 very different conflicts, depending on who you asked. For the Americans, it was a war of momentum. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with overwhelming firepower. Body counts were the primary metric of success. Helicopters, artillery, and sheer volume of troops were the tools of the trade. General Westmoreland's strategy of search and destroy was built on the assumption that the United States could simply outpace the enemy's ability to absorb losses. Pour enough resources into the problem, kill enough fighters, and eventually the enemy would break. The Australians looked at the same jungle and saw a completely different problem. When the first Australian task force, known as 1ETF, established its base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966, it inherited a province with a deeply entrenched Viet Cong presence. Local guerrilla units had operated in the area for years. The population had been living alongside, and in many cases, under the influence of the Viet Cong for a generation. Phuoc Tuy was not simply an area where enemy soldiers passed through. It was a place where the insurgency had roots, where the Viet Cong collected taxes, ran supply networks, recruited young men, and exercised a form of shadow governance that artillery could not dislodge. The Australians understood, perhaps more clearly than their American allies, that you cannot bomb your way to winning a population's loyalty. The unit tasked with knowing the jungle before anyone else arrived was the Special Air Service Regiment, the SASR. These were not conventional soldiers in any meaningful sense. The SASR operated in small patrols, typically 4 to 6 men, inserted deep into enemy-held territory by helicopter or on foot, with minimal support and maximum silence. Their job was not to close with and destroy the enemy in the traditional sense. Their job was to watch, listen, track, and report. And when the conditions were exactly right, when the enemy was caught unaware, when the ground favoured the patrol, when withdrawal was possible and clean, then, and only then, would they act. This philosophy had a name inside the regiment. It was sometimes called the hunter patrol concept. The idea was deceptively simple. A hunter does not chase his prey through the forest making noise. A hunter studies the patterns of the animal, understands its routes, anticipates where it will be, and waits. The SASR applied this logic to jungle warfare with a discipline that was, by almost any account, extraordinarily effective. Patrols would be inserted into the jungle and then disappear for days or weeks at a time. They moved at a pace that civilians would find agonizing. sometimes covering only a few hundred meters in an entire day, stopping constantly to listen, to observe, to ensure they had not been detected. They slept in shifts, always with a man awake and watching. They ate cold food. They communicated by hand signals. They left no trace of their passage if they could help it. The jungle for these men was not an obstacle to be pushed through. It was a medium to be inhabited, understood, and used. Where other soldiers saw darkness and danger, the SASR saw cover and advantage. What the Americans were doing wrong. The contrast with American doctrine could not have been starker. Search and destroy operations, as implemented across much of South Vietnam through the mid-1960s, relied on inserting large formations of troops into an area, forcing contact, and then leveraging air power and artillery to inflict casualties. The logic was attrition, bleed the enemy faster than he could replace his losses. It was a doctrine built for a conventional war, applied to an unconventional one. The problem with attrition warfare against a guerrilla force is that the guerrilla controls the tempo of contact. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars operating in Phuoc Tuy were not obligated to stand and fight when large Allied formations arrived. They could disperse, melt into villages, cache their weapons, and return when the helicopters left. A battalion-sized sweep through a jungle province might cover hundreds of square kilometers, make sporadic contact, suffer casualties to booby traps and ambushes, and withdraw having achieved very little of lasting value. The enemy simply waited them out. Body counts, as a measure of success, were also deeply unreliable. Incentive structures inside American units sometimes led to inflated reporting, and even when accurate, killing enemy soldiers did not address why young men in the Mekong Delta were willing to pick up a rifle and fight in the first place. The Viet Cong's ability to recruit was connected to political grievances, land reform, nationalism, and a decades-long struggle for independence that preceded American involvement entirely. Tactical success in the field was not translating into strategic progress, and many senior American officers knew it, even as they continued to prosecute the same approach. The machine kept moving, the strategy kept failing, and the jungle kept its secrets. The Malayan inheritance here is something that most Vietnam documentaries never tell you. The Australians had already fought this war before. Between 1948 and 1960, British and Commonwealth forces had fought a counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya against communist guerrillas operating in jungle terrain, not entirely unlike parts of Vietnam. The Malayan emergency, as it became known, was ultimately won, not purely through military force, but through a combination of targeted operations, isolation of the guerrilla from the civilian population, and political reforms that addressed some of the underlying grievances fueling the insurgency. It was a long, slow, unglamorous campaign. It produced no famous battles, but it worked. The lessons of Malaya were baked into Australian military thinking by the time units arrived in Phuoc Tuy. Patience mattered, intelligence mattered. Winning the confidence of local people mattered. Understanding the enemy's logistics and movement patterns mattered more than simply making contact. And the jungle itself was not the enemy. It was a tool if you knew how to use it. These were not abstract principles debated in staff colleges. They were the product of a real campaign in real terrain, fought by many of the same officers and non-commissioned officers who were now applying them in Vietnam. The Australians arrived in Phuoc Tuy not as students of counterinsurgency. They arrived as practitioners. The hunter in the undergrowth, the SASR patrols in Phuoc Tuy, operated with a philosophy that the jungle was their greatest ally. A patrol of 5 men moving without sound, sleeping without fire, communicating by hand signals, could spend weeks inside enemy-held areas gathering intelligence of extraordinary value. They would map supply routes, identify base areas, count enemy personnel, assess the condition and morale of Viet Cong units, and report the location of weapons caches and food stores. This information fed directly into planning for larger 1ATF operations, enabling the task force to strike with precision rather than speculation. Every operation built on the silence that came before it. But SASR patrols also conducted what became known as harassing ambushes. These were carefully set engagements where a small patrol would identify a likely enemy movement route, establish a position, and wait. When enemy forces walked into the killing ground, the Australians would engage briefly and with devastating precision, then break contact and withdraw before the enemy could organise a response. The entire philosophy was built on initiative and control. The patrol chose when to fight, where to fight, and for how long. The moment those choices passed to the enemy, the patrol was in danger. This is what veterans and analysts mean when they say the Australians refused to chase. Chasing, pursuing a fleeing enemy through terrain he knows better than you, at a time of his choosing, with your flanks exposed and your formation stretched, is exactly what a guerrilla wants. Every competent irregular fighter in history has understood that the moment you can make the pursuing force react to you rather than act against you, you hold the advantage. The SASR's doctrine refused to give that advantage away. Not once, not even when the temptation was there, not even when contact had just been broken and the enemy was still visible through the trees. The patrol stopped, observed, and disappeared. Tensions within the task force. There were real internal debates within 1ATF about how aggressive Australian forces should be. Not every officer in the task force came from a special operations background or shared the SASR's philosophical approach to the jungle. Conventional infantry battalions rotating through Phuoc Tuy brought their own doctrines and their own pressures. Pressure from American commanders to show aggression. Pressure from the political need in Canberra to justify the Australian commitment and the natural instinct of infantry soldiers trained to close with and destroy the enemy. The tension between SASR-style patience and conventional infantry aggression was a real feature of Australia's war in Phuoc Tuy, and it surfaced repeatedly in operational planning and command relationships. Some officers believed the Australians were too passive, that more aggressive patrolling would clear the province more effectively. Others, drawing on the Malayan experience and on the intelligence picture being built by SASR patrols, argued that the measured approach was working, slowly, unevenly, but working. These were not comfortable debates held in safety. They were arguments about doctrine conducted by men who would have to live or die by the decisions that followed. Reasonable soldiers on both sides were looking at the same jungle and reaching different conclusions about how to survive it. Long Tan and the cost of lost initiative, the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, is often cited as evidence of Australian tactical excellence, and it is. But it also illustrates with brutal clarity the risks that emerged when small forces found themselves in contact with a much larger enemy unit without full situational awareness of what they were walking into. D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was on a patrol when it made contact with elements of what turned out to be a significantly larger combined Viet Cong and North Vietnamese force. The ensuing battle, fought in a rubber plantation during a tropical storm, was an extraordinary feat of arms. Outnumbered, running low on ammunition, holding ground under intense pressure until artillery support and reinforcements arrived. 18 Australians were killed and 25 wounded. Enemy losses were considerably higher, with 245 confirmed dead found on the battlefield in the aftermath. Long Tan was a tactical victory, and the courage of the men who fought it deserves every recognition it has received. But it was also a reminder of exactly what the SASR's doctrine was designed to prevent: The jungle in Phuoc Tuy held forces capable of surrounding and overwhelming Australian units if the initiative was lost. The philosophy of never chasing, never pressing contact beyond what could be safely managed was not timidity. It was a rational response to a real and deadly truth that in the jungle, the side that loses control of the engagement loses everything. What the silence achieved, Long Tan showed what happened when initiative slipped away. What the SASR built, patrol by patient patrol, was the opposite. A systematic, relentless accumulation of knowledge that made the enemy's movements predictable and his hiding places visible. The intelligence gathered by SASR patrols during the years from 1966 to 1971 was, by most assessments, the foundation on which 1ATF's operational effectiveness in Phuoc Tuy rested. Patrols would spend days tracking enemy logistics routes, identifying where the Viet Cong were storing rice, weapons, and ammunition, and relaying coordinates back to headquarters. This intelligence enabled 1ATF to conduct operations that were targeted rather than speculative, hitting where the enemy actually was, rather than sweeping through areas and hoping to make contact. The difference between those two approaches is not merely tactical. It is the difference between a war that makes sense and a war that simply makes noise. The wider American strategy, in contrast, frequently produced operations that destroyed agricultural land, displaced civilians, and generated exactly the kind of grievances that fed insurgent recruitment. The gap between American tactical success in individual engagements and the failure of the broader strategy was becoming visible by the late 1960s, and it was a gap that body counts could never close. Post-war analyses by Australian military historians and researchers at the Australian War Memorial have generally assessed the SASR's performance in Phuoc Tuy favourably, particularly in the context of what intelligence-led patient operations could achieve. American analysts conducting post-war reviews also took notice, pointing to the Australian model as an example of counterinsurgency conducted with a sophistication that the dominant American approach never achieved at scale. A lesson that outlasted the war. The first Australian task force withdrew from Phuoc Tuy in late 1971, with the last remaining elements departing in early 1972. The war continued without them, and South Vietnam fell in 1975. The broader American strategy had failed at the strategic level, whatever its tactical achievements in individual engagements. But in the small province where Australian soldiers had operated for 6 years, something enduring had been demonstrated, something that could not be measured in body counts or hectares cleared or hamlets secured. The core insight they brought to Vietnam, that patience, intelligence, precision, and restraint produce better results than aggression, volume, and pursuit, has outlasted the war itself. It shaped Australian Special Operations doctrine for decades. It influenced how forces approached later conflicts from East Timor to Afghanistan. It became part of the institutional memory of a regiment that continues to operate today. The lesson was not that you should never fight. The lesson was that you should fight on your terms, at your time, in conditions you have chosen and prepared. The moment you start chasing, you have already begun to lose. The stories the regiment's veterans told were rarely about the firefights. They were about the times they waited, about lying motionless in the undergrowth while an enemy patrol passed close enough to touch, about setting an ambush on a trail they had watched for a week and executing it in seconds before vanishing back into the green. About the discipline, the extraordinary, almost inhuman discipline of watching an enemy unit move past and letting it go because the conditions were not right. About the 5 seconds after a contact ended, when every instinct screamed to pursue and the training said stop, hold, disappear. That is what "we don't chase" means. It is not a slogan. It is a philosophy of warfare that understands the difference between contact and control, and insists, absolutely and without exception, that the second must precede the first. In the quietest corners of the Vietnam War, in a province most people couldn't find on a map, 5 men lying still in the dark proved something that armies have struggled to accept ever since. That sometimes the most powerful thing a soldier can do is nothing at all, and wait. Because the jungle remembers everything. History remembers everything. And the soldiers who understood that are still the most dangerous ones who ever set foot in that war. If this video stayed with you, you already know someone who needs to see it. Share it with them right now, because this kind of history deserves to be heard beyond the classrooms and the military archives where it has been sitting for 50 years. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment hit you hardest. Was it the patrol lying still while the enemy walked past? The contrast between the two doctrines? The quiet truth that the most dangerous soldier in that jungle was the one you never heard coming? We read every single comment, and your perspective matters. Hit the like button if you believe that the quieter chapters of history deserve just as much attention as the famous battles. And if you want more stories like this one, stories of patience, precision, and the soldiers that history almost forgot, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter is already coming. The jungle has more secrets, and we are just getting started.